Re-Zero, Arc 7, Chapter 100, A Myriad of Changes at the Bastions.
The Cloud Dragon Mazoya's senility, the startling revelation of the truth drove Emilia into a tremendously difficult corner. Emilia, I didn't have to beat Volcanica at the time, all I had to do was do my best and complete the trial, but, on the highest floor of the Pleiades watchtower, her encounter with the divine dragon Volcanica was concluded by her touching a stone monument at the peak, even further above the tower. As for Emilia, she was still unsure as to whether she had properly resolved Volcanica's trial. However, the ancient dragon had presented to Emilia one of its claws as proof, so, for now she considered this a symbol of approval. However, her fight with Volcanica had fundamentally been a defensive one with no intention of beating him, so it was not a battle at all, and this situation remained the same even if the opponent changed from the divine dragon to the cloud dragon. If anything, Emilia, I have no other choice but to beat it, but Mazoya has lost R. As she was saying this, Emilia leapt up from her spot and closed in on the dragon from the air, shaking its long whiskers without revealing what was reflected in its eyes. The dragon mercilessly slashed its claws towards the puny existence flying towards it. It was a simple attack, but just one strike would be more than enough to kill someone if it connected. The dragon's claws were much sharper than any run-of-the-mill sword, and could easily cut Emilia's body right in half. Soldiers. However, Emilia was able to avoid this attack by jumping even further into the sky. The midair foothold that Emilia used was provided by an ice soldier who had leapt together with her and put up both of its arms for Emilia to jump off. Naturally, the ice soldier couldn't escape in time and fell prey to the dragon's claws, which smashed it to pieces. Keeping this sacrifice in her heart, Emilia's long legs kicked Mazoya in the face. Emilia delivered this kick with footwear made of ice, which each had a large, extremely sharp spike, forming fiercely lethal weapons. Since Emilia had used her foot, she did not pull any punches with this merciless kick, so an absurdly brutal blow slammed into the side of Mazoya's defenseless head. However, Emilia, it's not working at all. Mazoya's huge body did not budge an inch from getting kicked in the face. However, it appeared to be irritated. Feeling a sense of hostility on her skin, Emilia greatly swung her upper body to do a midair flip, using another ice soldier to dodge the incoming thrust from the dragon. Lacking behind the shattered one, another ice soldier had leapt even further up and stretched out both of its legs from above. Aligning both their soles, Emilia launched herself off of them towards the ground below. While the sound of shattering ice resounded in her eardrums, Emilia landed on the white ground with her hand, and then looked up towards the majestic cloud-wreathed dragon that calmly floated in the air. Mazoya, I am Mazoya. In accordance with the voice of mine dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies. Emilia, geez. Even after all of that, even after being kicked in the face and smashing apart two ice soldiers with its claws, Mazoya's words and demeanor did not change at all compared to when it had first descended upon the battlefield. Emilia, it must have considered Emilia to be an enemy. It was precisely for this reason that it was brandishing its claws towards the approaching Emilia as it flapped its wings and turned its unfocused white eyes towards her. But she just could not initiate a conversation. Just like with Volcanica, it was incredibly difficult to find common ground. The only potential clue might be, Emilia, Madeline. Just listen to me. Madeline, be quiet. Don't address this dragon so casually. Emilia's last ray of hope faded into the distance as her outstretched hand was violently shaken off. Even though Madeline had lost the flying winged blade she was able to wield with remarkable skill, Emilia's silver hair was still disheveled as she evasively leapt away. A small shadow followed right behind her. It was Madeline Ischart, who let out a white exhale as her golden eyes were set ablaze, and cracked the ground with every step while brandishing her destructive arm. Narrowly avoiding it, Emilia bit down on her molars. The tactic of rapidly lowering the temperature had served its purpose of keeping the rampaging Madeline and Mazoya away from the others on the battlefield, but it was difficult to push it any further. Madeline, human. With a wicked glint in her eyes, Madeline cloaked her small body in white steam. It felt like she was matching the cloud-wreathed Mazoya, but there was a difference. Madeline's body temperature was so absurdly high that every single snowflake evaporated once they came into contact before they could even reach her. The same thing was also happening around Mizuya. The puck copycat tactic was not really effective on these two. That being the case, Emilia, icicle line. With the ice wall separating the battlefield still in place, Emilia changed the flow of the cold air. Aborting an ineffective strategy to preserve her strength was not what she was doing. Since she had covered too large of an area, it did not have the desired effect on Mizuya and Madeline. Emilia, how about all this cold? Drawing invisible white lines around the head-on approaching Madeline, Emilia concentrated the cold air permeating the battlefield around the second bastion into a single spot. It was not just any ordinary cold, it was a truly extreme cold that wrapped around Madeline's small body, changing the steam into snow and causing the dragonkin's body temperature to instantly plummet below freezing. Madeline, even Madeline had her whole body frozen still by this unforeseeably extreme cold. Madeline's eyes widened as her vision whited out. However, Emilia threw away her last bit of pity and focused on pouring all of her power into temporarily freezing her solid. Emilia, please. Directing all of her power towards freezing Madeline, Emilia was praying for Mizuya's observed conduct. The participation of the cloud-wreathed cloud dragon in the melee would force Emilia to halt her attack prematurely. However, in the corner of her field of view, she saw Mizuya floating in the sky with an empty expression and no indication of wanting to interfere with Madeline's predicament. Emilia, weird, but, in this situation, Mizuya's standstill helped her out a lot. When Madeline's voice had called out and Mizuya made its appearance from the sky, Emilia realized that she was cornered into an even more hopeless situation. However, by the look of it, Madeline and Mizuya were not cooperating at all, as they were continuously switching between one of them attacking on their own and the other standing idly by. From Emilia's perspective, the situation continued while she alternated between opponents in a one-on-one fashion. Of course, Emilia's stamina was still slowly being whittled away, and she could not think of Madeline, nor Mizuya, as opponents that she could easily take down in a one-on-one fight. Nevertheless, Madeline, Emilia, I'm sorry, Madeline. I think it would have been better if I could have properly talked to you. But, since you refused to listen, I'm going to need you to be obedient now. Madeline, Madeline's whole body violently creaked, and she flashed her sharp fangs as her eyes blazed. However, once the inner part of her body was chilled to the very core of its core, even the extremely stout and vigorous dragonkin was unable to avoid her freedom being snatched away. Madeline, her blood and flesh, her bones and skin, all of it was frozen white, and Madeline was imprisoned in ice by Emilia. It had concluded just before Madeline's hand, which she had suddenly stretched out, could reach Emilia's chest. With her hand still pointed at Madeline, Emilia looked at the immobile girl and let out a long exhale. Emilia, that was a close one. Patting her chest in relief, Emilia lowered her eyebrows at the young girl that had been colored white. She did not feel delighted nor regretful for having won or lost. Above all else, this did not mark the end quite yet. Emilia, Mizuya, you may not understand what I'm saying, but you need to stop fighting. If you really can't communicate no matter what, then go home for today. Emilia had considered the possibility that Mizuya would have become incredibly angry the moment she defeated Madeline, so she was slightly relieved to see that Mizuya did not make any movement. However, unable to let that relief slip through to her expression, Emilia glared at Mizuya with a sharp look on her face. She was trying to act like she still had plenty of strength left in her. However, the truth was that Emilia actually did not have much strength remaining. Although she had succeeded in freezing Madeline in ice, she would need to continue keeping Madeline chilled in order to maintain her in that frozen state. That, too, required the continued use of energy. Hence, even though she had stopped Madeline, it would be very difficult to fight Mizuya. If possible, the best thing Mizuya could do would be to turn back from here. That was why, Emilia, in the case that you still want to keep going, then I also have a plan. With a sharp glare in her eyes, Emilia declared such to Mizuya. It was a lie. Even though she said it with immense confidence as she glared at Mizuya, it was an outright lie that Emilia had any kind of plan. She thought that if she insisted, Perhaps Mizoya would think Emilia was dangerous and run away. Following the example of Subaru and Otto, it was a rare bluff from Emilia. Mizoya, I am Mizoya. In accordance with the voice of mine, dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies, to which, a deep, low voice from Mizoya's mouth replied so. Emilia became disheartened by Mizoya's undecipherable behavior, as it was unclear whether or not it could see what was before its eyes, but she was determined not to be defeated and did not decrease the severity of her gaze. And then, Mizoya, I am Mizoya. In accordance with the voice of mine, Emilia, huh? Mizoya, in accordance with the voice of dear child. Mizoya's words, which it had repeated over and over and over again no matter what she said to it, were cut off halfway through, immediately began to falter, and did not continue after. It was not just that. Mizoya, who had been sitting peacefully within the snowy sky, frowned somewhat painfully, and began to sway its large head from side to side. Emilia, what's wrong all of a sudden? Does your head hurt? Seeing the change in Mizoya, Emilia's amethyst eyes widened in surprise. It would only be natural that Mizoya would lash out in anger when Madeline was frozen in ice. It would be very troubling if it did that, but that would be easier to accept than this kind of weird reaction. Above Emilia's head, as she worried about that, Mizoya's movements came to an abrupt halt. Mizoya, the dragon, which had been shaking its head in pain, suddenly looked down with a serene expression. Met with the gaze of those white eyes, on a face that had grown out a long beard, Emilia let out a short ah. Now, for the first time, she felt as if she had been seen by Mizoya's eyes. In other words, it was a sign of will and intelligence dwelling within Mizoya's eyes. Emilia, finally, we can talk. Mizoya, I believe I told you, human. Emilia, with a low voice, resounding as if the sky had roared, the dragon turned its head to face Emilia. She was pierced by its gaze. However, Emilia's body stiffened because of a different shock. She was seen by something mightier than herself. That was not what had surprised her. The reason was because the violent emotion in its voice was just like the one that had just been directed at her just a few moments before. No, because it was exactly the same. Indeed, as if to confirm the stiffened Emilia's surprise, the dragon continued. Mizoya, this dragon doesn't have anything to say to you. Emilia, model. Upon seeing something unbelievable, Emilia involuntarily ceased her movement. Turning towards Emilia, the dragon opened its mouth. Then, it simply exhaled. That breath became a white light, and the true essence of the cloud dragon filled the world. The dreadfulness of when a definite will dwelled within the dragon's power rained mercilessly down upon Emilia. The influence of the battalion intervening from the west had spread across every corner of the battlefield. Of course, the most affected by this battalion was the garrison at the 4th Bastion, which was brought to the brink of collapse after suffering unparalleled damage in one fell swoop. However, even if it was not directly affected, it could be said that the 3rd Bastion was influenced the most by changes the Pleiades battalion had on the state of the battle. Originally, in order to nullify one of the trump cards of the imperial city Lupagana, the magic crystal cannon, the soldiers sent to the 3rd Bastion were supposed to be abandoned. Zika was told of the plan by Abel and had been prepared to sacrifice himself. Thanks to his maneuvering, some of his forces, the people of Shudrak, had escaped the rays of the magic crystal cannon, a minor difference compared to the damage that should have been caused to the 3rd Bastion. In any case, the 3rd Bastion's soldiers were expected to be lost at this point. The moment they prevailed, Abel's initial calculations, which were based on the premise that the rebels would suffer a painful defeat, went out of the window. However, there should be nothing wrong with the soldiers surviving. Immediately correcting the miscalculation, Abel adjusted the original strategy to the current situation. As a result, Zika, that is High Countess Serena Drakroy's flying dragon squadron, in the midst of the battle with the stone golems, Zika wielded his sword and whispered this while on his beloved horse, Lady. Their round eyes turned towards the azure sky, half deprived of its color in white and red. Flying above the various battlefields, winged brethren clashed and turned their fangs onto each other. On one side was a flock of natural flying dragons following the orders of the flying dragon General Madeleine Eschat to rampage with their untamed ferocity unleashed. Pitted against them were the squadrons of flying dragons carrying their partners on their winged backs, the flying dragon riders with their blades of ferocity in their trusty sheaths. The wild, unmanned flying dragons clearly outnumbered the flying dragon riders, but anyone would agree that the latter were far more skillful in aerial combat. While the wild flying dragons were overflowing with ferocity and violently swinging their claws and fangs, the skills of the flying dragon riders were far more splendid and refined in comparison. Avoiding the fangs with dexterous moves that completely disregarded being in the air, the flying dragon riders used their weapons to pierce the wings of the wild flying dragons and felled them one after another. Zika, what a staggering difference! Only Zika, who was acquainted with the general of the flying dragon riders as a general second class of the empire, could tell which of them was hopelessly outclassed. It was the wild flock of flying dragons being led by Madeleine. Nonetheless, the violence created through numbers was difficult to handle, and the fact that they had been completely outnumbered in the fortress city was a deep thorn in his heart. This perception was about to be overturned once again. For better or worse, he was about to witness the true strength of traditional imperial flying dragon taming with his own eyes. Zika, to inform His Excellency about the success of his plan, I must push onward. As Abel played his card, the flying dragon squadron of High Countess Drakroy, the air supremacy of the flying dragon flock was diminished, and Zika was even allowed to affirm his surroundings. Although he charged at the front lines for the sake of the troop morale, Zika was by no means competent as a fighter during live combat. He would instead order timely formation instructions and advance further into the heart of the enemy lines. This threat had not abated at all yet, so he proceeded further towards General First Class Moguro Hagane, who had assimilated with the castle wall. Zika, I pray Miss Beatrice is safe. And so, as Zika raised his sword, a corner of his mind was occupied with the girl with pale-colored hair wearing a gorgeous dress, the all but certain savior of his life, Beatrice. The moment the magic crystal cannon had been unleashed, as Zika was prepared to face death, he saw the figure of a girl throwing herself in front of the incoming light to repel it somehow. Beatrice was small to begin with, but high up in the sky she seemed to be the size of a pebble. Still, Zika was convinced that this was undoubtedly Beatrice. To never mistake a woman he had once beheld with his eyes, that was Zika's special ability. That was why Zika could definitively say that it was Beatrice who had managed to do something about the magic crystal cannon. The problem was that he was also certain that no one could accomplish such a feat without a cost. Zika, please, be unharmed. He would wholeheartedly raise his voice for Beatrice to be awarded with the greatest medal of honor for rewriting this predicament, but above anything else, he wished for her to be safe and secure. But Zika, who had avoided certain death in the middle of the battle, had a role to play as a general, so all Zika could do was pray that all of his remaining fortune may fall to that girl. Meanwhile, just as Zika had been praying for the safety of the one who had just contributed so much on the front line, Tarata witnessed the moment the magic crystal cannon had unnaturally vanished, and who had accomplished it. Tarata, I was told to back off, but luckily I had a clear view of the battlefield. The rebels had been hit hard but had managed to get back on their feet. Zika, who was about to launch an assault with them, ordered the people of Shudrak to provide cover from the rear. The decision to not include the Shudrak in the general strike, to which Myzelda obviously raised her complaint, was accepted by Tarata, since Zika of all people would have thought this order through. But there was no way. Myzelda, there is no way that only we are unable to help in any way. We Shudrak are being looked down upon. Tarata, sister, looking back on what had happened, Myzelda had every right to voice her anger. The Crystal Palace in the imperial capital was originally the castle where Abel lived. It was hard to believe that Abel did not know about the magic crystal cannon, and Zika's unnatural instructions were also hard to accept. Perhaps it had been Zika's own judgment to have the Shudrak stand down. Zika was ready to become a sacrificial pawn, and the Shudrakians were prevented from following suit. Myzelda said they were being looked down upon, but that probably was not entirely true. It had been Zika's compassionate decision. However, Tarata, I too feel the same way as you, sister. I'm not happy with Zika's concern. Tarata came to the same conclusion as the belligerent Myzelda. Known as the womanizer, Zika knew how to treat women with more than just a certain amount of respect, and neither Tarata nor anyone else had any right to say anything about how he should behave. However, neither Tarata or anyone else from the people of Shudrak had any obligation to let anyone dictate their ways. So, Tarata gripped her bow forcefully and said, "Tarata, let's take that complaint directly to Zika." "My Zelda, a good response. At this rate, Zika and Jamal will take all the good stuff from us. You hear that, brethren?" My Zelda, dexterously thrusting her prosthetic leg into the earth and raising a large machete, called out to her compatriots. All of the arrayed Shudrak responded to my Zelda's words and Tarata's readiness with their eyes, faces, and voices, as if they were of the same mind. Then, with great enthusiasm, they headed towards the front line of the third bastion protected by Mogoro Hagane. Just as the Shudrak's group was about to march on, seems like there's quite the motivated group here. Hearing a cold, dry voice, Tarata and my Zelda turned around. Tarata instantly grabbed an arrow from her quiver and lowered herself to a ready stance. The appearance of the other party was so abrupt that it made the people of Shudrak raise their vigilance. However, the caution of Tarata and the others quickly melted at the sight of the other person's appearance. Slowly stepping on the grass, approaching from behind Shudrak's group, was a girl with pink-colored hair swaying in the wind, and above all else, a girl with a familiar face. No, that was not accurate either, the reason being that the girl before them was a different person from the one bearing the face that Tarata and the others knew. Somehow you guys are staring in complete wonder? Is it because of the appearance out of thin air? In that case, the answer to that mystery is a jump-off of a flying dragon. Tarata, no. That's not what we're surprised about. If so, then come out with it. Tarata, your face looks exactly like the one of a girl we know. The pink-haired girl tilted her head at the Shudrak's gaze. When my Zelda answered the girl's question, she glanced lightly at the girl's light crimson eyes. Then, with a short breath she said, "Is that so?" Did you get along well with that girl with the same face? My Zelda, at least, we were rather fond of her. My Zelda answered the question of the girl with light crimson eyes with a stern nod. It might have been a statement on behalf of all of them, but Tarata had no objection to it. And all of Shudrak had an inkling of the identity of the girl in front of them. Natsuki Subaru mentioned it once. He had said she had a twin sister. The twin sister with the identical face to the girl Tarata and her group knew muttered once more, "Is that so?" And then, in that case, Ram is sure she and you guys will get along just fine. She stepped forward while stating that as if the way was cleared for Ram. The girl who proceeded like it was a matter of course stood before Tarata and my Zelda. Tarata nodded as she gazed into those light crimson eyes. Tarata, yes, I hope so. What's the situation? Ram has got the gist of it, assuming that there aren't any cowardly women here right now, right? Looking around at the faces of the Shudrak, Ram quietly spoke. She was able to see through the reason why the people of Shudrak were positioning themselves so far away from the battle for the third bastion occurring right in front of them. After seeing through it, and acknowledging the thoughtfulness of the matter, she spoke. Ram, men say things like "I'm worried about you, and you'd better stay back," but Ram would prove them wrong, telling them to mind their own business. Tarata, I agree, stating that, standing beside Ram, who was holding a wand, Tarata repeatedly nodded silently. Compassion, care, and concern were not welcome by the Shudrak on the battlefield. Rather, these ways they had once discarded had to be taught to them. With Ram feeling a certain realization, she faced forward with Tarata following suit. Then my Zelda lined up across from Ram, bearing a wild smile on her face, and, Tarata, I've never met you before, but I'm convinced. You're a warrior, just like Rem. With a thud, there came a shock that resonated to his very core, as if a heavy weight had been caught in his internal organs. Those out-of-the-ordinary sensations continued once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, while the strain seemingly increased, as the feeling of shackles around his hands and feet impeded his movements. One after another, he gave in to his violent urges to shake them off and step over them. However, your approach is too straightforward. Kafma might let you get away with this, but I'm not haphazardly heading into a fight with an opponent at the outset. Car. With 5 outstretched fingers, the old man's face sank into the ground and disappeared, leaving behind his ridicule. Immediately after looking him in the eye, he registered the presence behind him and splendidly launched a backhanded fist. The tremendous response shattered his opponent's spine, but the rebounding sensation told him that it was something different from the old man. Looking at it, it appeared to be one of the corpses from the battlefield that the old man had flung out from the sunken ground. By the time he realized that he had been successfully duped, it was already too late. Here you go, getting caught again. The body flung over the backhanded fist, as his shoulder got struck from behind. In other words, the vicious old man Olbart did not move from the ground that he had dove into, but simply leapt to another location. The small old man, lightly touching his shoulder, escaped backwards while showing off his fine set of teeth. He merely touched. Neither struck nor slashed. Was he just playing around? Or insulting? No, Olbart never did things without meaning. There was always a meaning, a meaning, a meaning. Who? The moment his thoughts got heated, an even greater heat combusted on his right shoulder, where he had been touched. Looking at it, Olbart's strikingly red handprint had been stamped upon his shoulder. The handprint seeped blood and spewed smoke, as it attempted to burn skin, flesh, and bone. There was no hesitation. Immediately after he determined that it was poison, Garfield opened his mouth wide to bite off the shoulder that had the red handprint imprinted on it, tearing off the poison eating away at him. The taste of his own poisoned flesh and blood was terrible, as the bone his fangs grazed raged in unbearable pain. However, the pain was only momentary. The deeply gouged out shoulder wound erupted in a stream of blood, as the wound was restored by a tremendous surge of flesh. Olbart, that might be Thar best move, but you're sure are a reckless one. Garfield, breathing heavily, then got hit squarely in the nose by one of Olbart's kicks. When Garfield's head snapped back from the astonishingly powerful kick of the puny-looking old man, his nose was broken, and he was blown off his feet. He tumbled across the rough ground with a somersault, his whole body sprawled out in a heap. If it were not for Garfield's sturdy neck, the kick could have splattered his head into a million pieces. However, his head and torso stayed connected. Slowly lifting his hand, he placed it on his broken nose, and with one breath, he put it back in place. A harsh sound echoed throughout his nose. Olbart, geez, being hard to kill is a weapon in its own right. Not in the sentimental sense, but in the physical sense. You're too much trouble, you know that? Looking at the painful sight, Olbart sighed in exasperation, waving his left hand in the air. Just how many times had this vicious old man attacked Garfield with such relentlessness? At the very least, the vicious old man could not count them with the fingers on his only remaining arm. Garfield, shut the fuck up, old man. This ain't over. Garfield slowly rose as a heavy stream of blood spurted from his shoulder. With countless scars on his bare upper body and the aftermath of his fierce battle with Kafma Irelux still fresh in his mind, he clashed with one of the strongest in the Empire, yet his fighting spirit still remained unwavering. Even by the standards of the Empire, many soldiers would recognize his bravery as impressive and admirable, but unfortunately, he faced a vicious old man who didn't care about the values of a warrior in the slightest. Shrugging, Olbart looked at him with an expression devoid of any admiration whatsoever. Olbart, I can't be overly bothered with gesture, can I? Well, the walls I've been slipping through have more of a weird smell to 'em. There are some troublesome people out there, so things might get problematic if I don't head back, you know. Garfield, some troublesome people? Olbart, you can probably hear 'em if you prick up your ears. Don't tell me you can't hear better than an old geezer like me. As Olbart cupped his hand to his ear, Garfield realized it himself as he narrowed his vision. Vexing as it was, when he listened carefully, he understood what Olbart was talking about. Indeed, he was able to feel the sound of many extraordinarily powerful footsteps shaking the earth and the very atmosphere of this battlefield in his eardrums and on the soles of his feet. Olbart, no, you can't be serious. How brave do you gotta be to show your vulnerability in front of me? A moment later, explosives thrown by Olbart during this gap in attention erupted on both sides of Garfield's head. A thunderous boom and red light spread with a searing heat, exhibiting a power that would easily reduce a human being to dust, as Garfield's figure disappeared in the resulting blast of flame. Olbart, well, that's a little. Following this, Olbart stared into the burning flames. Garfield, Gar. The moment he was swallowed by the explosion, Garfield rushed towards him shouting, using the flames as a distraction. He imagined that if he showed an opening, Olbart would make a move. He did not know what exactly he was plotting, but he won the bet. Garfield's arms closed in on Olbart, who was blinded by his own attack, and, Olbart, you're young, greenhorn. As his outstretched arms were crushed, the surprised Garfield's jaw was kicked straight up from below. The jumping Olbart's foot stamped on his leaping face. Olbart stood on Garfield's upwards-looking face with one leg, and in that position the vicious old man looked off into the distance, as if to tease him. Olbart, the troops Kathma pulled back'll be enough tar to fend this place. No one will get out of here without you. With this deliberate statement, Olbart declared his intent to no longer continue this battle. With bloodshot eyes, Garfield raised his arms despite the broken elbows, and tried to crush Olbart's minuscule frame atop his face. But Olbart jumped just in time to avoid both arms. During his flip, the right sleeve of the vicious old man fluttered in the wind. Olbart, as expected, you wouldn't die even if your head flew off, would ya? Following this cold death sentence, Garfield felt the sensation of a drawn blade running down his spine, so he put all his strength into his neck muscles and leapt off this spot to the chest. The next moment, guided by the voice he heard, he unconsciously clenched his fists together in front of his chest. A hoarse voice faintly groaned, followed by a chain of violent sounds of steel being shattered. Instead of the joined fists in front of his chest, it was the thrusting blade that was shattered in front of Garfield. Olbart's unleashed thrust through the heart was a hidden blade replacing his lost right arm. With the tip of the blade shallowly buried in his chest, Garfield's body fell backwards. If he had been even slightly slower to react, Garfield's heart would have been ripped out, undoubtedly taking his life. No matter how much he could regenerate, even he could not replace a missing heart. If he had not followed the advice to keep a guard over his neck, he would have died, even though he knew that. Garfield, fuck off, ? Oh, that is so disheartening to hear. I thought I'd at least get to hear some words of thanks. As Garfield clicked his tongue, his back was being supported by someone standing behind him. When he entrusted his weight to him, he felt a hint of a wry smile coming from his aide's hands. Feeling even more annoyed from this, Garfield's nose wrinkled up. In general, Garfield was not good at hating people, but in front of him was Olbart, who belonged to the types of people he hated. However, the person he unmistakably despised the most was standing right behind him. Being caught in between two hated people, this was the worst possible situation for Garfield. Garfield, after I crush Thar old man, you're next? ? This finally carries taking things out on me to extremes, doesn't it? In a way, isn't me being the one coming here a stroke of luck? You wouldn't want Ram to see you in this state, would you? Garfield, Gar. Garfield's throat growled frailly as a nerve was struck. Garfield's aide behind him chuckled at his reaction. Olbart, whose hidden blade had been shattered, watched this back and forth from a short distance away. Olbart, just let me tell you that you're going to die if you come this way from that line on Thar ground over there. ? Pardon me, old man. I didn't quite catch that point. After all, I came from the sky. Olbart, from Thar sky, you say? Glancing skyward, Olbart closed one eye. Even his seemingly lethargic appearance was just part of the vicious old man's trickery to lead his opponents around by the nose. Garfield exhaled as he restrained himself from inadvertently leaping forward. He pulled the tip of the blade out of his chest, filling in the wound as he did so. Garfield, if you're here, ? Ram is on a different battlefield. I told her to back off, but she didn't listen. Garfield, to no one's surprise. And you went out of your way to come here? ? Of course, I also intend to be somewhat useful. You should consider yourself fortunate. As he said this, the duo set their gaze upon the troublesome vicious old man, and the man with an unfamiliar face was no longer behind Garfield, but next to him Roswell L. Mathers did not have his usual makeup applied, and his blue eye was closed to hide his identity. Roswell, to let you know, a shinobi and I killed each other before. He stated this with a deeply vicious smile rivaling his enemies. The moment the light was released, its power imbued with will, Emilia had a vision of her own death. Her competitive spirit was strong, and she must not lose hope under any circumstances. For Emilia, who had funneled power into her abdomen with that attitude, it had been a devastating thing. Emilia, in her head, a small Emilia was screaming that she needed to move immediately. However, her body would not respond with which way she should move, right or left. Even though she would usually move without thinking, she could not do so. The reason for that was that her heart, not her head, had immediately sensed that right or left, forward or backward, there was no place to escape. Emilia, icicle line. So, instead of running away, Emilia had chosen to defend against it, to deflect it, creating a thick wall of ice in front of herself and letting the light slide over its slanted surface. Whether or not she could do it, it would be done with the conviction that she had to. When the dragon's breath had been released from the sky in Garrel, Emilia had immediately chosen the same defense. However, that time, Priscilla was there and had managed to cut through, clear away the light that Emilia had weakened, even if a little, with the red treasured sword she had. This time, Priscilla was not there. Emilia was alone. She did not know if she could do the same thing. However, she must accomplish the same thing. Emilia, me, and the people behind me. At a glance, Emilia knew that there was no chance that the power of the light that had been released would blow only her away. Earlier, the same kind of light had been released in the distance, and this one resembled that. The light would surely mow down the battlefield and destroy everything. So, Emilia, do your best, me. She braced her legs, created a wall of ice in front of her body, and tightly squeezed the ice sword in her hand. She had created the ice sword because Priscilla had used her treasured sword to cut through the breath. This ice sword did not have the same power as that treasured sword, but it had been for luck. That, Emilia's bracing, where she put forth her all, was, Mazoya, disappear, human. The breath was released, and white light poured down, closing in on Emilia. That the voice had come forth from Mazoya's throat, and the origin of the anger in its eyes. In that moment, she forgot all of it. She forgot, and braced herself, and then, the moment when that breath obliterated the wall of ice, swallowing even Emilia. After trying to align her ice sword with the light, Emilia's eyes widened in surprise. The light that was emitted would have caught Emilia, but instead, it had just slightly veered off to the side. Even so, an enormous shockwave had been produced, almost tearing off Emilia's silver hair and clothes. While bracing and enduring that, Emilia looked at Mazoya to see what had happened. Mazoya had released a breath, but its head was turned diagonally upward. It was not that it had changed its mind right before it happened. The orientation of its neck had been forcibly changed. By the impact of the flying winged blade, the deadly weapon that had struck it in the face from the side. Emilia, that has to be the one that I held over there. It was Madeline's weapon of choice, the flying winged blade, which Emilia had accidentally hurled far away when she had tried to throw it back at her. It had slammed into Mazoya's face. No way, Emilia said, her eyes widening. Emilia, could it be, I threw it and now it came back? Ha 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 ha. That's a really dreamy and wonderful thing to imagine. But unfortunately no. It was stuck over there, so I just kicked it off. Emilia, kya? Having imagined a miraculous coincidence, Emilia was greatly surprised by the voice of her smooth-talking companion. When Emilia turned around flustered, the owner of the voice was crouching down right beside her, staring fixedly at the ice sword in Emilia's hand. This is wonderful with quite beautiful craftsmanship. I've been thinking that if it's for carrying around with me, a legendary sword would be appropriate, but if it's just for looks, I'd want to put this on my list of candidates. Emilia, thanks? No, if anyone should be saying thank you, it should be me. The person to whom that voice belonged, a boy with blue hair tied back. He smiled cheerfully at Emilia, who had not expected to be praised in such a situation, and reflexively thanked him. He straightened his bent knees and stood up. Then, blue-haired boy, a white and red light divided the blue sky. I was wondering which way to go, but when I came rushing in, I found a big dragon and a beautiful woman waiting for me. As expected of me. Don't you think my pull is too strong, Emilia? Blue-haired boy, don't you think it's too strong? After being asked once more by those sparkling eyes, Emilia felt compelled to answer, and replied, I think it's really strong. At Emilia's answer, the boy's smile deepened into a satisfied smirk. Blue-haired boy, right. Saying that, he took a step forward from beside Emilia, into the gaze of the cloud dragon. Emilia hesitated in saying that's dangerous and trying to stop him. It was a sense of pressure. But it was not caused by the gigantic dragon, but by the small back in front of her, because of what that out-of-place, cheerful boy had caused. Blue-haired boy, the grand stage has come around. Come on, everyone, watch. Don't blink and miss out on the big moment of the Blue Lightning Cecilus segment, or you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Not taking even a single step back in the face of the transcendent dragon, the boy Cecilus segment, thus loudly and majestically proclaimed.